Welcome back. Well, child obesity is growing in South Africa. In fact, according to the 2019 SA Child Gorge Report, at least 13% of children under the age of 5 years old are obese. When positive finding, there's a decrease in the number of children deficient in vitamin A. So to tell us more about the findings, I'm joined now by Laurie Lake, editor of the 2019 Child Gorge Report, an education specialist from UCT's Children Institute. Laurie, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. I mean, these stats around child obesity are actually quite alarming, especially in a developing country.
Yes, it's of great deal of concern. What we see in South Africa is really a dual burden of malnutrition. On the one hand, 1 in 4 young children are stunted. That means they're chronically malnourished, and it's not just a matter of them being short for age. Stunting actually impacts on their cognitive development, their education and their employment prospects across the life course. So there's a real concern around stunting, which is associated with high levels of child poverty. So we're looking at 60% of children in South Africa living below the poverty line. But at the same time, we're seeing a dual epidemic, a rising epidemic of obesity starting early in childhood. So 13% of young children obese. By the time you're looking at adolescent girls, that rises to 40% of young women. And the concern around obesity is not simply a question of overweight. The concern is that obesity is associated with a growing burden of non-communicable diseases in adulthood, such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancers. And this burden is really placing strain on resources that are already stretched really thin in the public health system. So one of the things this issue of the child gauge is really calling for is greater investment, early investment in childhood and adolescence in order to break this cycle. And it's not simply the cycle of malnutrition that we're concerned about. Similarly, if we look at the patterns of violence in society, there's a strong link between violence against women and violence against children. And in fact, children who experience violence or witness violence in the home at a very young age, for girls, they're more likely to become victims later in life, and boys are more likely to become perpetrators. So we start to see how what happens very early in childhood sets the trajectory for later health and development. So we really need to up the game, starting really, really early. Even preconception, but particularly in the first 1,000 days of life. So pregnancy through to a child's second birthday is a time where the developing brain and body are particularly sensitive to environmental cues. And then again in adolescence, where there's a second rapid period, particularly of brain development. And these investments carry forward across the life course. Yeah. So they're not going to only improve outcomes and health for children today, but also the adults they will become tomorrow and their children's children.
But also, when we're talking about investment, it needs to be investment in the home as well, Laurie. And the reason why I'm saying this is because socioeconomically, one would say that there's socioeconomic factors that contribute to children being obese. I was making reference earlier on to how, for example, if it's a single parent in a household, because they work such long hours, many times they don't even cook the meals, they just rely on takeout to help with the child. And sometimes those takeouts become much cheaper than actually meal preparation.
I think it's a two-way game. So on the one hand, yes, they're choices that we make as parents and caregivers of children, and that matters a great deal. The way in which we respond to children, we spend time talking, playing, singing, reading to children. That's really, really important. What we feed them is important. But we also need to understand the ways in which individual choices are shaped by what we call the broader food environment. And what we've seen in South Africa, and in fact globally, is an increase in the marketing of what we call obesogenic foods, foods that are highly processed, full of sugar and salt. And these foods are flooding supermarkets in the townships. They're penetrating deep into rural areas, and those foods are cheap and easily accessible. So it's incredibly hard for many people in South Africa to make healthy food choices for their children. So you're looking at an intersection between poverty and an industry that is producing and marketing these unhealthy foods. So one of the things the Gauge is calling for is for government to step in and to better regulate unhealthy food and to promote or make more accessible healthy choices that are affordable for everyone.
Laurie, we're going to leave it there for this morning, but thanks a lot for joining us, shedding some light in terms of child obesity. I'm telling you now, the stats are absolutely startling. With that, hopefully from obesity